The text message had been a single jagged shard of glass in the placid pool of my life. Kelly's pub. Now. Or I go to her. There was no need to ask who her was. For 20 years, her name had been the ghost at every family gathering that never happened, the empty chair at every holiday I spent alone, the silent scream behind every one of my professional successes. Mrs. Gable. The reek of stale beer and regret hit me the moment I pushed open the heavy oak door of Kelly's pub, a dive bar on the industrial outskirts of Portland that my brother Owen called his second home. It was a world away from the sterile, lemon-scented corridors of the pediatric hospital where I spent my days, and an even farther cry from the minimalist glass-walled house in the West Hills that I shared with my fiancé Mark. Owen was hunched over the bar, a silhouette of frayed denim and resentment, nursing a glass of amber liquid that was surely not his first. He didn't turn as I approached, his eyes fixed on his own haunted reflection in the mirror behind the bar. I didn't speak, just slid onto the stool next to him, the worn vinyl cold against my tailored slacks. The silence stretched thick and suffocating, broken only by the low drone of a sports recap on the television and the clink of glasses. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rasp that scraped against the polished calm I wore like a suit of armor. He told me he was tired. Tired of the lies, tired of the charade, tired of seeing our father's face waste away behind plexiglass while I played the part of Portland's saintly Dr. Reed. I kept my hands folded neatly on my purse, my knuckles white. I reminded him, my voice dangerously level, that we had an agreement. That our father's sacrifice was meant to give us a life, not to be a weapon we used against each other. He let out a short, bitter laugh that sounded like breaking glass. A life, he gestured around the dim, grimy bar. He said this was his life. A dead-end job at a warehouse, an apartment that smelled of damp, and the constant gnawing knowledge that our entire family was built on a foundation of rot. Then he turned to face me, and the full force of his 20-year-old fury hit me. His eyes, so much like our father's, were bloodshot and blazing. He said my life, my perfect, curated, expensive life, was the real prison. He accused me of building a mansion on top of our father's grave, and that I had the audacity to call it living. The words were meant to hurt, and they did. They were poisoned darts, each one dipped in a truth I had spent 2 decades trying to outrun. But I held my ground. I told him he was drunk and wasn't thinking clearly. I offered him money, a familiar, pathetic olive branch I'd extended countless times before. I said I could help him get into a program, find a better job, start fresh. That was when he played his final card. He leaned in close, the smell of whiskey sharp and sour on his breath, and his voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper that was louder than a shout. He informed me that he'd done some digging. That it wasn't hard to find her. Mrs. Gable. He said she still lived in the same small house in the Laurelhurst neighborhood, the one with the rose bushes her son had planted for her the spring before he died. He described how he had sat in his car across the street, watching her, an old woman now tending to those same roses, her back stooped with a grief that time had clearly not healed. He told me he'd thought about what he would say, how he would introduce himself. Hello, Mrs. Gable. My name is Owen Reed. You don't know me, but my father is in prison for killing your son. Except he didn't do it. My sister did. A cold dread so potent it was almost metallic on my tongue flooded my body. This was it. The precipice I had been walking along for 20 years. I could feel the ground crumbling beneath my feet. I stared at him, at the twisted satisfaction on his face, and I saw that this wasn't about money or getting clean. This was his revenge. His way of burning down the whole rotten structure, even if it meant he would be consumed by the flames alongside me. He wanted to reclaim the only thing he felt he had left, the truth. I left the bar without another word. The drive home was an automated blur. My Mercedes handled the slick, rain-swept streets of Portland with an effortless grace that felt like a mockery. Each swish of the windshield wipers seemed to be scrubbing away the composed facade of Dr. Evelyn Reed, revealing the terrified two-year-old girl hiding underneath. I pulled into the heated garage of my architectural masterpiece of a house, the silent electric door sealing me into my beautiful sterile cage. Inside, Mark was in the kitchen preparing a salmon dish he'd read about in a gourmet magazine. The air smelled of dill and white wine. He smiled as I walked in, his face, the very picture of uncomplicated love and contentment. He was a good man, an architect whose world was one of clean lines and solid foundations. He knew my father was in prison for manslaughter, the result of a tragic drunk driving accident years ago. It was the neat, digestible version of the story I presented to the world, a version that painted my father as flawed but tragic and me as the resilient daughter who had overcome a difficult past. Mark knew nothing of the jagged, ugly reality. He came over and kissed my forehead, telling me I looked pale and asking if it had been a rough day at the hospital. I nodded, murmuring something about a difficult case, a child who wasn't responding to treatment. The lie came as easily as breathing. It had to. For 20 years, my life had been a series of lies, each one a brick in the fortress I had built around myself. That night, I lay awake long after Mark's breathing had deepened into a steady rhythm. I stared at the ceiling, the carefully recessed lighting casting soft, unobtrusive shadows, and my mind replayed the scene from 2 days prior. The Tuesday visit. It was a ritual I had performed on the third Tuesday of every month for 20 years. The drive to the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem was a 70-mile pilgrimage into my own personal hell. The penitentiary was a sprawling, brutalist monument to failure, all gray concrete and coiled razor wire under a perpetually overcast sky. The visitor's room was always cold. It smelled of disinfectant and despair. I would sit on a hard plastic chair, my purse on my lap, and wait for him to be brought out. And then he would appear behind the thick, smear-proof glass. Samuel Reed, my father. At 65, his hair was completely white, and the lines on his face told a story of a life lived under the harshest of conditions. But his eyes, when they met mine, were always the same. They held a fierce, unwavering love that was both my sanctuary and my damnation. Our conversations were masterpieces of unspoken truths. We talked about the weather, my work at the hospital, Owen's latest struggles. He would ask if I was happy, if Mark was treating me well. I would tell him yes, that everything was wonderful. We never ever spoke of that night. We never mentioned the rain, the screech of tires, the sickening thud. We never spoke of the lie we had forged together in the crucible of panic and a father's desperate, misguided love. During our last visit, he had looked more tired than I had ever seen him. A persistent cough rattled in his chest, and his skin had a grayish pallor. He pressed his hand against the glass, and I mirrored the gesture on my side, the cold, unyielding barrier, a perfect metaphor for our relationship. He told me, his voice a low rasp through the speaker, that as long as I was living a good life, a full life, then every single day he spent in that concrete box was worth it. He said he was proud of me, proud of the woman I had become. Every word of praise was a hot coal pressed against my skin. His sacrifice was not a gift, it was a life sentence of a different kind. He was trapped behind bars of steel, and I was trapped behind bars of guilt, my perfect life, the gilded cage he had built for me. He thought he had saved me that night, but what he had really done was preserve the terrified girl I was, freezing her in time, and forcing me to construct an elaborate, successful woman around that hollow core. Now, lying in my silent, moonlit bedroom, the weight of that sacrifice felt heavier than ever. Owen's threat had changed the equation. He was about to detonate a truth bomb that would not only destroy my life but would also render our father's 20 years of suffering utterly meaningless. He would die in prison not as a tragic figure who took responsibility, but as a fool who covered for his cowardly daughter. His sacrifice would become a pathetic footnote in a story of deceit. And then there was Mrs. Gable tending her roses. A woman whose face I had only seen in old newspaper clippings, a face etched with a quiet, dignified grief. For 20 years, she had believed a lie. She had directed her sorrow, perhaps even her hatred, at the man behind the glass, the wrong man. Owen's threat of revenge against me was cruel, but the injustice I had perpetrated against her was a sin of a different magnitude. It was a theft of truth, a perversion of grief itself. I slipped out of bed and walked to the large picture window that overlooked the sleeping city of Portland, its lights twinkling like a fallen constellation. I had everything a person could want. A respected career, a beautiful home, a man who loved me. I had achieved the American dream built on the rubble of another family's nightmare. My brother's words echoed in my head. Chị sống trong nhung lụa còn cha thì mục giữa trong tù. I had become a brilliant doctor, an expert at healing children, at mending broken bodies. But I had never known how to heal the one thing that was truly broken, my own soul. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass. The face, looking back, was a stranger's, calm, composed, successful. But beneath the surface, the scared two-year-old was screaming. Owen had finally done it. He hadn't just threatened me, he had handed me an ultimatum. He thought he was seeking revenge, but what he had really given me was a choice. Continue living this lie and let our father's legacy be a sham, or face the truth and destroy everything I had built. The bill for the last 20 years had just been delivered, and my brother was the one holding the invoice. The time for payment was long overdue. Sleep was not a refuge. It was a continuation of the trial. I found myself running down an endless rain. Slicked road, the glare of headlights blinding me, the sound of my own ragged breaths loud in my ears. I would wake with a jolt, my heart hammering against my ribs, the silk of my $1,000 sheets feeling like a shroud. After the third time, I gave up. I slid out of bed, the cold of the hardwood floor, a welcome shock to my system. Mark was a motionless lump under the duvet, oblivious. For a moment, a wave of bitter envy washed over me. The bliss of a clear conscience. My perfect house felt alien, hostile. The clean lines and minimalist decor seemed to mock me, a stage set for a play in which I no longer knew my lines. I couldn't stay there. Driven by an impulse I didn't try to understand, I grabbed my car keys, slipped on a pair of sneakers, and crept out into the pre-dawn chill. The Mercedes started with a silent hum, a ghost in the sleeping, affluent neighborhood. I didn't have a destination in mind, but my hands, acting with a memory of their own, steered the car away from the hills and down into the flatlands of the city towards the east side, towards the past. I ended up parked across the street from the house on Prescott Street. My childhood home. It looked smaller, sadder than I remembered. The cheerful blue paint my father had applied one long ago summer was now peeling, revealing patches of gray, weathered wood underneath. The lawn was overgrown, choked with dandelions, and a "for sale" sign, faded and tilted, was stabbed into the patchy grass. After my father was sentenced, my mother couldn't bear the weight of the memories and the neighbors' stares. She sold it to a rental company, packed 2 suitcases, and moved to Arizona, severing ties with a surgical precision that I had both resented and in a way admired. It had been a rental property ever since, a temporary home for a string of faceless families. Now it was empty, waiting for the next chapter. A ghost ship adrift in a sea of tidy working-class homes. The air was damp and smelled of wet earth and exhaust fumes. This place was the complete antithesis of my current life. There was no polished concrete or floor-to-ceiling glass here. There was just wood and memory and rot. I got out of the car, the key, the original house key I had no reason to keep but could never bring myself to throw away, feeling heavy and cold in my palm. It slid into the lock with a rusty groan, and the door swung open into a cavern of darkness that smelled of dust and time. Stepping inside was like stepping into a photograph. The layout was exactly as I remembered, a map of my childhood etched into my bones. That was the spot where I'd tripped and split my chin open. That was the wall where my father had meticulously marked my height each year in pencil. The marks were gone now, painted over a dozen times, but I could still see them. I ran my hand along the wall, half expecting to feel the faint indentations. My feet carried me through the empty rooms, my footsteps echoing like accusations. I walked into the kitchen and could almost see my father standing at the stove, flipping pancakes on a Saturday morning, his brow furrowed in concentration. He wasn't a man of many words, but his actions were his language. He taught me how to change a tire, how to read a map, how to be self-sufficient. He built me a bookshelf when my paperbacks began to overflow, and he never once complained about driving me to my late-night study sessions. His love was a quiet, constant, structural thing, the foundation upon which I had built my life. Until I shattered it. I wandered out the back door and into the yard. The garage stood at the end of the cracked concrete driveway, its door hanging slightly askew. This was his sanctuary. The place smelled of sawdust, oil, and coffee. It was here, in this garage, surrounded by the ghosts of old tools and forgotten projects, that the first, most vivid memory struck me. I was 16. The vehicle wasn't my sleek Mercedes, but my father's beat-up Ford Ranger, a temperamental beast with a finicky clutch and the turning radius of a freight train. He was teaching me to drive. I remember the frustration, the lurch and stall of the engine as I failed to find the sweet spot between the gas and the clutch. I had been close to tears, ready to give up. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply turned off the engine, looked at me, and told me that control wasn't about force. He explained it was about listening, about feeling the machine, knowing when to push and when to ease off. He said that a moment of panic, of slamming your foot down on the wrong pedal, could change everything. His words, so practical and calm then, were now a prophecy that had come true in the most horrific way imaginable. We spent the rest of the afternoon practicing, and when I finally managed a smooth start, the look of quiet pride on his face was a brighter reward than any A+ I had ever received on a report card. Now, standing in the derelict shell of that same garage, the memory was so sharp it felt like a physical blow. That same man, the one who taught me about control and consequences, was the one who had taken the fall for my ultimate loss of it. The irony was a blade twisting in my gut. I retreated back into the house, an archaeologist of my own ruin. I needed something more. I needed to see his face, the face of the man he was, not the grayed-out version I visited through plexiglass. I went to the small attic, pulling down the creaky folding stairs. The air up there was thick and heavy, smelling of mothballs and decaying paper. In a corner, under a dusty sheet, was a stack of old boxes. One of them was labeled photos. My hands trembled as I opened the brittle cardboard flaps. There we were. A family. My mother younger, smiling. Owen, a gap-toothed kid with a mischievous grin. Me with my awkward teenage bangs. And him, my father. In every photo, he was slightly off to the side, a steady, unassuming presence. There he was holding my hand at my kindergarten graduation. There he was attempting to assemble a bicycle on Christmas morning, surrounded by a sea of incomprehensible instructions. And there he was standing next to me on my 22nd birthday, just a few months before the accident. We were in the backyard and I was holding up my acceptance letter to Johns Hopkins Medical School. I was beaming incandescent with triumph. He had one arm around my shoulder and his face wore that same expression of quiet, profound pride. Seeing that picture, seeing the hope in his eyes, the untarnished love, was what finally broke me. I sat there on the dusty floorboards of the attic and the carefully constructed dam of the last 20 years burst. The sobs were violent, primal things ripped from a place so deep inside me I had forgotten it existed, because the photo was a lie. The promise in that picture was a future that never happened. I wasn't just crying for my father in prison or for Owen's bitterness or for Mrs. Gable's loss. I was crying for that girl in the photograph, the one whose future seemed so bright, the one who had no idea she was standing on the edge of a cliff. And with the tears came the memory I had spent a lifetime suppressing. It didn't come back in a gentle wave, but as a full-blown, immersive assault on my senses. The rain. It had been a torrential downpour, the kind that turns roads into black mirrors and blurs the world into a watercolor of bleeding lights. I was in my own car, a second-hand Honda Civic I'd bought with my summer job earnings. My boyfriend at the time, Kevin, was in the passenger seat. We were fighting. He had been talking about us getting a small apartment together near the local state college while my mind was already 3,000 miles away at Johns Hopkins. He accused me of being cold, of caring more about my career than about him. He said I was arrogant, that I thought I was too good for this town, too good for him. His words were hitting their mark, poking at my deepest insecurities. I was shouting back my voice, raw, telling him he was scared of my ambition, that he wanted to drag me down. My hands were clenched on the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I was driving too fast, fueled by anger and adrenaline. He reached over and turned the music up, a blast of sound that shattered the tense atmosphere. I yelled at him to turn it off, and in that split second of distraction of looking at him instead of the road, it happened. He wasn't in a crosswalk. He was just there. A dark shape, a man with a grocery bag stepping out from between two parked cars. I saw him for a fraction of a second. There was no time to think, only to react. My father's words about panic, about slamming your foot down, echoed in some distant part of my brain, but I did it anyway. I slammed on the brakes. The car hydroplaned on the wet asphalt, the tires screaming. There was a sickening thud, a sound that was both heavy and hollow at the same time, and the man disappeared. The silence that followed was absolute. It was deeper than silence. It was a void. Kevin was frozen, his mouth open in a silent "oh." The windshield wipers kept their rhythmic, hypnotic beat, swish, 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 as if nothing had happened. I stumbled out of the car. He was lying on the road, unnaturally still. The grocery bag had burst, and a carton of milk was bleeding, a white stream that mingled with the rain and the darkness. I didn't check for a pulse. I knew. I just knew. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. All my plans, my ambitions, my entire future, I saw it all dissolving in the pouring rain. My carefully constructed life gone. And in that moment of pure selfish terror, I did not call 911. I called my father. My voice was a strangled whisper on the phone. I told him what happened, where I was. He didn't ask questions. He just told me not to move, that he was coming. He arrived in less than 10 minutes, his old Ford Ranger cutting through the rain. He didn't look at the body on the road. He looked only at me. He saw my shaking hands, my shattered expression, and in that moment he made a decision. He became my savior and my jailer all at once. His movements were calm, efficient. He told Kevin to go home and to never speak of this to anyone. Then he took a rag from his truck. He meticulously wiped down the steering wheel, the door handle, the gear shift, everywhere I might have touched. He took my keys, put them in his pocket, and placed my limp hands on the steering wheel of his truck. He told me to drive home and not to stop. He said he would handle it. His voice was the same calm, steady voice that had taught me how to drive, now teaching me how to run. I did as I was told. I drove away, leaving my father standing in the rain with my car, my crime, and a dead man on the pavement. The police came to our house an hour later. They found him there, smelling of whiskey he had poured on himself from a flask. He confessed immediately. He told them he'd had a few drinks at a bar, that he was driving too fast, that he never saw the man. It was a perfect, tragic, believable story. I watched from my bedroom window as they put him in the back of the patrol car. Before he got in, he looked up and our eyes met. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a nod of blame. It was a nod of reassurance. It was the moment he locked his cage from the inside and handed me the key. A shrill, ringing sound ripped me from the attic, from the past. I fumbled for my phone, my hands slick with sweat and tears. The screen glowed with a single name, Owen. I answered, my voice a hoarse croak. His voice was different this time. The drunken bravado was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp edge of finality. He said he had been thinking. He told me he was done waiting for me to do the right thing. He gave me 48 hours. He said I had 2 days to go to the police, to go to Mrs. Gable, to fix the mess I had made 20 years ago. If I didn't, he would go to her house himself, knock on her door, and set the truth free. He called me Evie, a name no one had used in decades, a name that belonged to the girl who had stood by her bedroom window and watched her father sacrifice his life for her. Then he hung up. I sat there in the suffocating silence of the attic, the phone still pressed to my ear. The dust motes danced in the single beam of light from the small window. For 20 years I had been running. Now I had hit a wall. The past was no longer behind me. It was in front of me, a ticking clock, counting down the last hours of the life I had so carefully, so deceitfully built. The phone felt like a block of ice in my hand after I hung up. The silence in my cramped third-floor apartment was absolute, a dead thing. For 20 years that silence had been my companion, my tormentor. It was the sound of my father's life wasting away, the sound of my sister's success, the sound of a truth buried so deep it had poisoned the very ground our family stood on. My hands were shaking, not from fear but from a surge of adrenaline so pure and potent it felt like I had mainlined electricity. The 48-hour ultimatum wasn't a threat, it was a promise. It was the starting pistol for a race I had been waiting 2 decades to run. For the first time since I was a teenager, the suffocating blanket of despair that had been my second skin began to lift. In its place, a cold, sharp clarity settled over me. The pain was still there, a hot coil in my gut, but it was no longer a paralyzing force. It was fuel. I looked around my apartment, the peeling linoleum, the single window looking out onto a brick wall, the stack of overdue bills on the counter. This was the life her lie had bought me. A life lived in the shadow of a sacrifice I never asked for, a life defined by her cowardice. The rage, once a dull, constant ache, was now honed to a razor's edge. My suffering had reached its apex, and from this peak the only way forward was to bring her world crashing down. And with every brick I pulled from her foundation, I knew a piece of my own pain would crumble away with it. My first target wasn't her. It was her foundation. Her perfect, loving fiancé, Mark. The architect. The man who built things to last. I knew from Evie's carefully curated stories that Mark was a man of integrity, a man who valued honesty and solid structures. He was the main pillar supporting the glass house she lived in. I would introduce the first crack. I found his firm's address online, a sleek modern building downtown with a nameplate of brushed steel. I didn't call ahead. I walked in the next morning wearing my best pair of worn jeans and a flannel shirt that probably smelled of my apartment. I must have looked like a stray dog wandering into a showroom. The receptionist looked me up and down with polite disdain, asking if I had an appointment. I told her, my voice steady, that I was Evelyn Reed's brother, and that I needed to speak with Mark about a family emergency. The word emergency worked its magic. Mark met me in the lobby, his brow furrowed with a concern that was almost touching. He was exactly as I had pictured, handsome, well-dressed, exuding an aura of calm competence. He led me to a small private meeting room with a glass wall looking out over the city. He offered me coffee. I refused. I wanted him off balance. I wanted his full, undivided attention. I started my performance. I didn't shout or accuse. I played the part of the tormented, conflicted brother. I told him how much I admired him, how happy I was that my sister had found someone so stable. Then I let the poison drip. I began to talk about my father. I spoke of the 20 years he had spent in prison, how he had taken responsibility for his mistake without a single word of complaint. Mark nodded, his expression sympathetic. He said Evie had told him how tragic it was and how resilient she had been. That was my opening. I let a sad, ironic smile touch my lips. I told him resilience was one word for it. I said that living with a secret like ours required a different kind of strength. His brow furrowed again, a tiny crack in his composed facade. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. I asked him if Evie had ever told him that our father never touched hard liquor, that the man who confessed to a drunk driving accident was a man who might have 2 beers on a holiday but never whiskey. I told him I remembered that night clearly, that my father had been home with me watching an old movie, not out at some bar. I could see the gears turning in his head, the confusion warring with his loyalty. I pressed on. I told him about the letters my father sent from prison, how they were full of strange coded messages about protecting Evie, about carrying her burden, about ensuring her future was secure no matter the cost. I made it sound like my father was a man obsessed, a man whose guilt had perhaps unhinged him. I was not presenting a clear accusation. I was presenting a puzzle with a missing piece, a foundation with a structural flaw that only a skilled architect like him might notice. I told him I was worried about Evie, that the weight of our family's tragedy was crushing her, making her say and do things that didn't make sense. I painted her not as a villain, but as a victim of our father's misguided sacrifice. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. I was turning her own shield, the story of her resilience, into a weapon against her. By the time I stood up to leave, Mark's face was a mask of turmoil. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a deep, unsettling doubt. He shook my hand, his grip limp, his eyes searching mine for an answer I had no intention of giving. He promised he would talk to Evie, that he would make sure she was okay. As I walked out of that steel and glass tower and back into the gray Portland air, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years washed over me: satisfaction. It was a clean, sharp, exhilarating sensation. The hot coil of pain in my gut had cooled just a little. I had taken my first swing at the glass house, and I had heard the faint sound of a crack. For the first time, I felt a flicker of power, a sense of control over the narrative that had controlled me for my entire adult life. The suffering was still there, but it was no longer just a burden. It was a weapon. That evening, I executed the second part of my plan. This one was aimed at her career, her identity. Dr. Evelyn Reed, the healer of children, the pillar of the community. Her professional reputation was everything to her. It was the armor she wore to prove to the world and to herself that our father's sacrifice had been worth it. I went to a public library in a different part of the city. Using one of their computers, I created a new anonymous email address. I drafted a careful message. It was addressed to the chief of pediatrics at her hospital, a man whose name I had also found online. The email was a model of concerned anonymous reporting. I wrote that I was a former acquaintance of the Reed family and felt an ethical obligation to share some information. I mentioned that while Dr. Reed was a brilliant physician, there were troubling aspects of her family's history that the hospital might not be aware of. I referenced the well-publicized manslaughter conviction of her father, Samuel Reed. Then I planted the second seed of poison. I wrote that there had always been whispers in our old community, unsettling rumors that the official story of the accident was not the whole truth. I suggested that Samuel Reed's confession might have been a desperate act to protect another family member. I didn't name Evelyn. I didn't have to. I simply posed the question: what would it mean for the hospital's reputation if its star pediatrician was discovered to be embroiled in a decades-old deception involving a man's death? I ended the email by stating that I hoped, for the sake of the children she treated, that her psychological resilience was as strong as her medical skills, as living under such a shadow must surely take a toll. I hit send. The click of the mouse was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. The pain in my gut receded further, replaced by a cold, thrilling calm. I hadn't lied. I had simply presented the truth wrapped in a question, a carefully aimed missile designed to create chaos and scrutiny in the one place she felt safe. I had attacked her two pillars, her love and her work. Now all I had to do was wait for the tremors to begin. I didn't have to wait long. My phone rang just after 10 that night. It was her. Her voice was not the calm, condescending tone she usually used with me. It was thin, brittle, and vibrating with a fury she was barely managing to control. She demanded to know what I had done. She said Mark had come home and asked her questions she couldn't answer, that he had looked at her with suspicion for the first time in their relationship. Her voice cracked on the last word. The sound was music to my ears. It was the sound of my suffering being transferred atom by atom to her. I stayed calm. I told her I had no idea what she was talking about. I was just a concerned brother worried about my family. She started screaming, then a torrent of accusations and threats. She accused me of trying to ruin her life. I let her finish. When she was done panting into the phone, I spoke, my voice low and even. I told her that her life was built on the ruins of our fathers. I reminded her that the clock was ticking. She had 36 hours left. I said that Mark asking a few questions was nothing. I told her to imagine what would happen when the hospital's ethics committee started asking questions. Or the police. Or Mrs. Gable. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by dead silence. I had her. I had finally, after 20 long years, backed her into a corner from which her money, her prestige, and her carefully crafted lies could not save her. I told her this was her last chance to control the story, to confess on her own terms. I said that after 36 hours the story wouldn't be hers to tell anymore, it would be mine. Then I hung up. I stood in the middle of my dark apartment, the phone in my hand. The shaking was gone. The coil of pain in my gut was no longer hot but cool and dormant. The suffocating weight of my own helplessness, a weight I had carried since I was a boy, was gone. In its place was a feeling of profound, terrible satisfaction. I wasn't just Owen Reed, the screw-up, the bitter brother living in the shadows. I was the architect of her destruction. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. The 36 hours following my call with Evelyn were the most alive I had felt in 20 years. The gnawing, impotent rage that had been my constant companion had finally been given a purpose. It was no longer a poison eating me from the inside out. It was a blueprint. I was no longer a victim of my sister's lie. I was its architect of justice. The pain hadn't vanished, but it had transformed. Each successful step of my plan was like a dose of powerful anesthetic, numbing a piece of the chronic agony and replacing it with a clean, cold surge of purpose. I knew Evelyn. Her Achilles heel wasn't her money or her career, it was her obsession with control. She had spent 2 decades meticulously managing every detail of her life to keep the truth contained. My ultimatum had wrested that control from her. Now she was scrambling, trapped in a cage of her own making, while I stood outside holding the key. But I wasn't going to simply unlock the door. That would be too easy, too quick. No, I was going to dismantle the cage piece by painful piece and force her to watch. My plan required more than just threats. It required precision. It needed to be a symphony of destruction, and I would be its conductor. The first movement had been to destabilize her personal and professional life. The second would be to force a confrontation she couldn't run from. A simple confession to the police felt inadequate. It was too sterile, too impersonal. Justice in my mind required a witness. It required her to face the human cost of her actions. It required her to face Mrs. Gable. My first step was to learn everything I could about the woman whose life my sister had shattered. This was not a task for a drunk, bitter loser in a bar. This was a task for a methodical, determined man. I spent the next day at the Central Library, not the local branch near my apartment. I needed anonymity. I scrolled through 2 decades of archived local news, piecing together the life of Margaret Gable. Her son Daniel had been 24, a recent graduate working his first job and saving up for law school. He was her only child. After the trial, Mrs. Gable had become a quiet advocate for victims' rights, but mostly she had withdrawn. Then I found it, the key I needed. An article from a year ago about the Daniel Gable Memorial Scholarship, an annual fund she ran to help underprivileged students in the community. The article mentioned the yearly fundraising event, a quiet, somber gathering with a silent auction held at the Laurelhurst Community Center. The event was scheduled for the next evening, less than 24 hours before my deadline for Evelyn expired. The timing was a gift from whatever cruel god was overseeing this tragedy. It was perfect. The next step was to set the stage. I couldn't just drag Evelyn there. She would bolt at the first sign of a trap. I had to make her walk into it willingly. I needed to use her weakness, her desperate need to regain control, and I needed to use her knight in shining armor mark. Back at the library, I used the same anonymous email account to contact him again. My tone this time was one of urgent, feigned empathy. I told him I was deeply sorry for the distress my previous visit had caused. I explained that my family was broken and that I had acted out of pain. I told him that I loved my sister and that the last thing I wanted was to destroy her happiness. This I knew would appeal to his desire to fix things, to build bridges. I then proposed a solution. I suggested that the 3 of us meet to talk away from the tension of their home. I said we needed a neutral public space where we could speak calmly and find a way forward. I proposed a time, 7 p.m., the following evening, and a location, a quiet, upscale coffee shop called The Daily Grind on Southeast Cesar E. Chavez Boulevard. It was, of course, directly across the street from the Laurelhurst Community Center. The final piece of the puzzle was the most delicate. I had to get Mrs. Gable there. This couldn't be done from behind a keyboard. It required a human touch. That afternoon I drove to her small, tidy house. The rose bushes Owen had described were there impeccably kept. I didn't knock on her door. That was a line I wouldn't cross, not yet. Instead, I waited. An hour later, she emerged heading to her car. I followed her at a safe distance to a local grocery store. Approaching her felt like stepping off a cliff. My heart pounded in my chest. This was the woman my family had wronged beyond all measure. I caught up to her in the produce aisle. I called her name softly, and she turned her eyes pale blue and clouded with a permanent sadness fixing on me. My performance had to be flawless. I told her my name was Owen and that I had been a casual acquaintance of her son Daniel back in the day. A lie, but a necessary one. I told her I admired the work she did with his scholarship fund and that I had been meaning to contribute. This softened her expression slightly. Then I leaned in, my voice dropping. I told her the real reason I was speaking to her. I said that a person had recently contacted me, someone who was tormented by guilt over Daniel's death. I told her this person had information that could change everything she thought she knew about that night. Her hand, holding a head of lettuce, began to tremble. Her eyes, which had been distant, were now laser-focused on mine, filled with a sudden sharp intensity. I saw 20 years of unresolved questions surface in an instant. I told her this person was terrified but wanted to confess, and that they had agreed to be at the Daily Grind coffee shop at 7 p.m. the next evening. I said I believed she, Margaret Gable, deserved to hear the truth from their own lips. I told her I didn't know if this person would have the courage to approach her, but that they would be there. She didn't say much. She just stared at me, her mind clearly racing. Finally, she gave a single sharp nod. She thanked me, her voice a fragile whisper, and walked away. I had baited the hook. The trap was set. The following evening, I was parked half a block away with a clear view of both the community center and the coffee shop. My suffering had almost completely receded, replaced by the humming tension of a director on opening night. I felt a grim satisfaction, a sense of profound and terrible rightness. I was not destroying my sister's life. I was forcing it to finally become real. At 6:45, I saw Mrs. Gable walk towards the community center. She was with a younger woman, probably a friend or relative, for support. They went inside for the opening of the memorial event. My timing had been precise. She would be there surrounded by the memory of her son when it was time to cross the street. At 7:02, Evelyn's Mercedes pulled up to the coffee shop. She and Mark got out. Even from a distance, I could see the tension in her posture. She looked like a soldier walking into a minefield. Mark put a reassuring hand on her back as they went inside. The first actors were on stage. At 7:10, I saw Mrs. Gable and her companion exit the community center. They stood on the curb, looked both ways on the boulevard, and then began to walk across the street, heading directly for the glass front door of the Daily Grind. I leaned back in my seat, my heart beating a slow, steady, triumphant rhythm. The pain was gone. In its place was a vast, cold, and utterly satisfying calm. The curtain was rising. My sister, the star of the show, had no idea her audience had just arrived. The interior of the Daily Grind felt like a soundproof room insulated from the rest of the world. The air was thick with the rich, comforting smell of roasted coffee and steamed milk, a scent so jarringly normal it felt like a personal insult. Mark had chosen a small table in the corner, a feeble attempt at privacy in a space walled with glass. He sat across from me, his handsome face a mask of earnest concern. He believed he was here for a reconciliation, a family summit to heal old wounds. He had no idea he was a spectator at an execution. My execution. Every nerve in my body was screaming. Owen's phone call the night before, his cold final words had echoed in my head for hours. My conversation with Mark had been a disaster. He had come to me armed with Owen's carefully planted seeds of doubt, questions about my father, about my resilience, about secrets I might be keeping for my own good. I had tried to deflect, to use the calm, reassuring logic that had served me my whole life, but for the first time it failed me. My answers sounded hollow even to my own ears. I saw the doubt in his eyes solidify into a hairline crack in the foundation of our relationship. He loved me, but he was a man who prized truth and integrity above all else. He was an architect. He knew a flawed structure when he saw one, and the anonymous email to the hospital. That had been a masterstroke of cruelty. My boss, Dr. Alistair Finch, had called me into his office that afternoon. He was a kind, paternal man who had been my mentor for years. He approached the subject with excruciating delicacy, mentioning a disturbing and likely unsubstantiated email he had received. He assured me of his full confidence in me, yet the unspoken question hung in the air between us. Is there any truth to this? I felt my professional armor, the gleaming reputation I had spent a decade building, begin to corrode. The shame was a physical thing, a hot flush that spread from my chest to my face. I had left the hospital feeling exposed, vulnerable, as if everyone I passed in the hallway could see the 20-year-old secret branded on my skin. Now, sitting opposite Mark, I felt cornered. I had agreed to this meeting out of desperation, hoping I could somehow reason with Owen, buy more time, regain some semblance of control. My brother sat between us, a specter of my past brought to life. He wasn't the drunken, angry mess from the pub. He was unnervingly calm, his eyes holding a chilling clarity. He was the director of this play, and I was his unwilling star. He spoke first, his voice low and measured, weaving a narrative of brotherly concern for Mark's benefit. He said he was sorry for his part in our family's pain, and that all he wanted was for the truth to come out so we could all heal. The hypocrisy was so profound it was almost brilliant. He was setting the stage, positioning himself as the reluctant hero, the seeker of truth. Mark was watching him, then me, his expression, a mixture of hope and deep-seated unease. And then the bell above the coffee shop door chimed. I glanced up, my attention momentarily diverted. 2 women walked in. One was middle-aged, her face etched with a protective concern. The other was older, with silver hair and a fragile posture that belied an inner strength I could feel even from across the room. Her eyes, pale and searching, scanned the cafe. My breath caught in my throat. The world didn't just slow down, it froze. It was her, Margaret Gable. I had only ever seen her in grainy newspaper photos from 20 years ago, a face frozen in the immediate aftermath of grief. But I knew her instantly. Time had softened the edges of her face, but it had not touched the sorrow in her eyes. It was a sorrow I had put there, a sorrow I had fed with a lie for 2 decades. She didn't see me at first. Her gaze was sweeping the room, looking for someone. And then her eyes met Owen's. I saw a flicker of recognition, a silent acknowledgement pass between them. The blood in my veins turned to ice. This wasn't a coincidence. This was not a random meeting. This was the final act. Owen hadn't just brought me here to talk. He had brought me here to be judged. Mark, sensing the sudden cataclysmic shift in the atmosphere, turned to follow my gaze. He saw the 2 women, but to him they were strangers. He looked back at me, his brow furrowed in confusion, asking with his eyes what was wrong. My mouth was dry. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. My entire body was paralyzed by the collision of my 2 worlds, the pristine, successful life I had built and the ugly foundational lie it was built upon. Mrs. Gable's eyes left Owen and found mine. There was no accusation in her gaze, no anger. There was just a deep, bottomless well of questions. In that single silent moment of eye contact, my fortress crumbled. The walls I had spent 20 years building, my career, my relationship, my carefully constructed identity, turned to dust. She and her companion began to walk towards our table. Each step they took was a hammer blow against my chest. The comforting aroma of coffee now smelled like ash. The low hum of conversation in the cafe faded into a deafening roar in my ears. I was no longer Dr. Evelyn Reed, respected pediatrician. I was a scared 22-year-old girl standing in the rain next to a dead man, the consequences of my actions finally catching up to me. Mark looked from my ashen face to the approaching women, realization dawning in his eyes. He saw the absolute terror in my expression and knew instinctively that this was something far beyond a simple family squabble. Owen sat perfectly still, his face a neutral mask, but I could see the glint of triumph in his eyes. He was savoring this. He was savoring my utter and complete unraveling. This was his revenge, not loud and explosive, but quiet, precise, and absolute. As Mrs. Gable reached our table, she did not speak to me. She looked at Owen. She told him, her voice a fragile but clear whisper, that she had come as he asked. Then she turned her gaze back to me. The weight of that gaze was unbearable. It held the gravity of 20 lost years of a life stolen, of a grief misdirected. The silence that descended on our table was profound. It was a vacuum that sucked all the air from my lungs. Mark was staring at me, his face a mixture of horror and dawning comprehension. He finally understood. He might not have known the details, but he knew he was sitting next to a stranger. The woman he loved, the life they had planned, was an elaborate fiction. My mind went completely blank. There were no more lies to tell, no more strategies to deploy. The carefully organized files in my brain had been thrown into the air, and all I was left with was the raw, paralyzing truth. I was a fraud, a coward, a killer. My father had sacrificed his life to give me a future, and my brother had just burned that future to the ground. And as I sat there, pinned by the gentle, questioning gaze of the woman whose son I had killed, I felt a strange and terrible thing. It wasn't relief. It was the chilling sensation of absolute zero. The end of everything. My body was still sitting in the chair, but my soul had already begun its long, cold fall into the abyss. The betrayal wasn't just Owen's. It was my own. I had betrayed my father, I had betrayed Mark, I had betrayed Mrs. Gable, and most of all, I had betrayed myself, trading my soul for a life that was never truly mine to begin with. The silence stretched on, and I knew with a certainty that was as cold and hard as a tombstone that I would never be the same. The trial was over. The verdict was in. And my sentence had just begun. There is a silence that is merely the absence of sound, and then there is a silence that is a presence. It has weight and texture. It is a physical force that presses in on you, stealing the air from your lungs. The silence at that table in the daily grind was of the second kind. It was forged from 20 years of unspoken words of grief, misdirected, and of a lie that had consumed 3 lives. I was at its epicenter, a black hole of deceit, and I felt myself collapsing inward under its immense pressure. It was Mrs. Gable who finally broke it. She did not raise her voice. She did not weep. She looked directly at me, and with a quiet dignity that was more devastating than any scream, she asked a single question. She wanted to know if it was true. The words, simple as they were, shattered the last remnants of my composure. I couldn't look at her. I couldn't look at Mark, whose face was now a pale, rigid mask of shock. I couldn't look at Owen, the architect of this perfect, horrific moment. I stared down at my hands, which were trembling on the tabletop. A single choked sob escaped my lips. It was not a denial. It was a confession in its purest form. And then the story came out. Not in a coherent narrative, but in broken, ugly fragments torn from me by the sheer force of her presence. I spoke of the rain, the fight with my then-boyfriend, the blinding anger. I spoke of the sickening thud of the panic of the phone call that had sealed my father's fate and my own. With every word, I felt a piece of my carefully constructed identity flake away, turning to ash on the floor of the coffee shop. I was no longer Dr. Reed. I was the terrified girl behind the wheel of a Honda Civic. When I finished, the silence returned heavier, this time freighted with the grim reality of my confession. I finally dared to look up. Owen's face was unreadable. His victory did not seem to have brought him the satisfaction I'd seen in his eyes moments before. He looked empty, as if he had spent 20 years planning a party only to find himself standing alone in the room after all the guests had gone home. His revenge had been successful, but it had cost him the last piece of the family he had. Mark was the one who moved first. He pushed his chair back, the sound scraping loudly in the stillness. He didn't say a word to me. He couldn't even look at me. The man who had just that morning spoken of our future of building a life together now looked at me as if I were a complete stranger, a dangerous anomaly that had somehow wandered into his well-ordered life. He turned and walked out of the coffee shop, his back rigid. He didn't look back. I knew in that moment with an absolute and soul-crushing certainty that I had not just lost him. I had erased the very possibility of him. The love I had felt was real, but the woman he had loved was a fabrication. The betrayal I felt from Owen was a sharp, clean wound. But the betrayal I saw in Mark's eyes was a slow-acting poison. He was a good man, and I had made him an unwitting accomplice to my lie. I had tainted him with my deceit, and that was a stain he would never forgive. It was just the 3 of us now, Owen, Mrs. Gable, and me, the vertices of a tragic triangle. Mrs. Gable's companion placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, but she did not seem to notice. She was still looking at me, but the questions in her eyes had been replaced by a deep, weary sorrow. She told me, her voice trembling slightly, that for 20 years she had hated the man in the prison. She had written him letters filled with rage and pain which he never answered. She had attended his parole hearings, speaking out against his release. She had focused all her grief, all her anger on the quiet man who accepted his fate without a word. She said that now she didn't know what to feel. The target of her hatred for 2 decades was a phantom. She then looked at Owen. She told him that she understood his need for the truth, but she asked him, her voice laced with a profound sadness, if this public demolition of a life was truly justice, or if it was just a different kind of violence. That was the moment I saw my brother break. Her words struck a chord that my own pleas never could have. His cold, directorial calm shattered, and for the first time I saw the raw, agonizing pain that had been driving him. He looked at me, and then at her, and his face crumpled. He stammered that he didn't know what else to do. He said the silence was killing all of them. He had wanted to set the truth free, but now, watching the wreckage it had caused, he looked lost. The lesson was brutal and clear: revenge doesn't heal the wound. It just carves a new one in someone else. By destroying me, he had not fixed his own brokenness. He had simply created more of it. In the end, there were no dramatic scenes, no police sirens. Mrs. Gable stood up leaning on her friend. She looked at me one last time and said something I will carry with me for the rest of my days. She told me that her son Daniel had been a good man who was studying to be a lawyer because he believed in justice, but he also believed in redemption. She said that she would not be calling the police. She said my prison was not one the state could build. It was the one I would carry inside me forever, and that she seemed to imply was a far more profound sentence. They left. Owen and I remained two strangers bound by blood and a shared catastrophe. I had nothing left to say to him. My betrayal felt immense, but his felt like a different species of cruelty. My lie was born of a moment of panicked, youthful cowardice. His plan was born of 20 years of festering resentment. He had chosen his moment with a surgeon's precision not to heal but to inflict the maximum possible damage. He had sacrificed the last shred of our brotherhood on the altar of his own pain. I walked out of that coffee shop and left him sitting there. The life I returned to was a ghost of what it had been that morning. My house was just a structure of glass and steel, empty of warmth. Mark's things were gone by the next day. He left a short, formal note. There was no anger, just a quiet, devastating finality. My career ended not with a bang, but with a quiet meeting where I tendered my resignation, unable to bear the weight of my colleagues' pitying, questioning glances. The most profound lesson came a week later during my final visit to my father. The prison authorities allowed a contact visit due to his declining health. Without the plexiglass between us, I could feel his frailty. I told him everything. I confessed my confession. He listened patiently, his hand thin and bony covering mine. When I finished weeping, he was not angry. He just looked tired. He told me that the greatest betrayal was not mine, nor was it Owen's. It was his own. He said that on that rainy night he thought he was protecting his daughter. But he realized after years spent in a cell that what he had truly done was steal my chance to become a woman of character. He had taken my terrible mistake and made it his identity, but in doing so he had trapped me in a permanent state of childhood forever, the scared girl who needed her father to fix things. His sacrifice, born of infinite love, had been a profound betrayal of my own potential for growth, for atonement, for truth. He died 2 weeks later. Owen did not come to the small, sparse funeral. The truth had been set free, but it had not healed us. It had simply exposed the depth of our wounds and left us to bleed out alone. I am left now with the wreckage. My brother's revenge was a success. My life is in ruins. But his victory is a hollow one. And the lesson, the one that settles in my bones like a permanent chill, is a bitter one. Some truths don't set you free. They simply show you with blinding, unforgiving clarity the true dimensions of your cage.